Imagine we're on a long road trip together. We got it mapped out, we know where we're going, and so far things are going pretty much according to plan. And then, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the road just stops. It just dead ends. This doesn't make any sense, so we get out our map and our GPS and look, that doesn't help either. The road we had been on and assumed would continue is no more. Now what? Let me tell you about 7 men who had their futures all mapped out and who knew where they were going in life until their roads ended. 7 men who would then come together to reconstruct new paths forward. Now, the first night these guys met, none of them wanted to be there. None were excited about sharing the most painful chapter of their lives with people who they'd be meeting for the very first time. In fact, one gentleman was so nervous, he stayed in his car in the parking lot for a full 10 minutes and just about threw up before he finally decided to come on in. And once all the men were there, they took seats around a long oval table. Some made nervous small talk, others just stared down at their phones as we waited to get started. My colleague at the University of North Carolina, Don Rosenstein, a psychiatrist, and I, a psychologist, had invited them in there that night for the first meeting of a brand new support group. You see, each gentleman had recently lost his wife. But they weren't just widowers, they were widowed fathers. And this support group was for dads who had lost their spouses at a time when they had young kids at home. So we started off the group meeting by asking the men to go around one by one, introduce themselves, and tell their stories. And I'm telling you right now, it was one heartbreaking, heart-wrenching story after another. These men were devastated. They were overwhelmed with their grief, overwhelmed with the prospect of being an only parent, and still trying to make sense of a world that had fallen apart. After the last father finished introducing himself, the room sat silent. Even Don and I, who both work in a cancer hospital and are used to hearing about awful circumstances all day long, we both sat stunned too. It was just a collective magnitude of what these men had been through and what they faced was just stunning. It was actually Joe, one of the fathers, who ended up breaking the ice. He turned to the guys and said, I got to just kind of let everyone know something. I almost didn't even come tonight because I'm not a support group kind of guy. And immediately, all the heads around the table began to nod, right? None of these guys thought of themselves as support group kind of guys. But with that out of the way and on the table, the men started to talk more, and they started to connect about the things that made them different from others, but similar to each other. And for nearly the next 2 hours, these men were able to share things that they had kept inside since their wives had died. Even though the evening had ended better than it started, Don and I still weren't so sure, right? Maybe this had been too much. It was a really emotionally heavy night. Maybe this was exactly what these men didn't need right now. Maybe the first meeting of this brand new support group would end up being its last. But the next month, every one of those men that came the first night came back the second night. And with that, we were off. This was a special group. And every third Monday of the month, the men would come together to connect with the only people they knew who could understand. Now, early on, it was really just about these guys surviving and getting through the days, and that's what we heard a lot of the conversation about. I mean, they were just racked with grief, still disbelieving that this was their life and dealing with the uncertain and scary future. Above all else, what the men were concerned about was being good enough fathers. Or, as Neil put it one night, whether the wrong parent died. Bruce brought a story to group one evening that captured this perfectly. The week before, he'd been eating dinner with his 3 children when he looked down and noticed his 11-year-old daughter was wearing a pair of brand new bright white tennis shoes. He's pretty sure he didn't buy those for her, so he said, "Hon, where'd you get these shoes?" She said, "Miss Sanders." As in your teacher, Miss Sanders? Why in the world is your teacher buying you new shoes? She proceeded to tell him how, in her old pair, the stitching had become so frayed that the sole was becoming detached from the rest of the shoe. And on her way in from recess one day, Miss Sanders heard that shoe flapping in the hallway. Knowing what the girl had been through, Miss Sanders took her lunch break that afternoon to go out and buy her a new pair. As she told this story to her dad, Bruce's heart sank. Here was this girl walking around with a busted-up pair of shoes, and he had not even noticed. And he knew his wife would have never let that happen. And that feeling stayed with him, right in the pit of his stomach for days. But he didn't tell anyone. He didn't tell his friends or his family. How do you bring something like that up? And even if he could, he didn't want any pity, and he was done getting advice from people who couldn't understand. But on that next Monday evening, you better believe he shared it with those men. And as he told that story, he began to find some humor in it. Bruce is a funny guy. And he went on this whole riff about imagining what the teacher's lounge conversation must be about this poor father who can't even manage to clothe his kids. And the other fathers in the group jumped in as well and poked some fun at Bruce. And then they laughed at themselves because there was no shortage of parenting screw-up stories to go around that room. And it was this kind of humor that we saw evolve in these men, and it became vital to their grief and showed how much these men were trusting in one another and how much they didn't have that kind of opportunity to share that with anyone else, but in this forum, they could. Now, when it comes to grief, there is no such thing as a timeline, there's no such thing as a normal path, and there's no such thing as getting over it. People grieve individually. That said, most people, in most situations, see the intensity of their grief ebb over time. And eventually, we saw that in the men. The intensity of their grief was going down. And in a lot of ways, they were getting better. They were sleeping through the night. They had come out of that fog of grief that so many of us are familiar with. They were notching a few parenting wins here and there. And that was great, but that was one thing. And that thing is not the same as moving forward, right? These guys were doing better, but they weren't moving forward in the sense of intentionally and actively charting a new path to replace the ones that had been snatched away from them. And as the men realized this, and we talked about it in group, that became the singular focus of our meetings, was how could these guys build a future as much as they needed to come to terms with the past. There are three things these men taught us that I want to share today. First, before these guys could rebuild any new lives, they had to envision what that would look like. They had to reimagine a new life. And this was tough, right? They didn't want a new life. They wanted the one that they had lost. They wanted the one that included their wives, that included intact families and anniversaries and grandchildren together. That's the one they wanted, but that was gone. It also took courage to reimagine a new life because these men knew as well as anyone that just because they could reimagine a new future did not mean that future would be guaranteed. And they had learned that lesson all too well. It also meant thinking about new relationships and dating again. Now, early on, dating was not really even a part of the conversation in group, but eventually it began to sprinkle in. Now, none of the guys wanted to date at first, but eventually they did. And among the men who did not want to date at first was Steve. He had 3 young children, and he was focused on that and more focused on all that needed to be done at home. And besides, he still felt married anyway. But he had a friend who wanted to set him up with someone who he said was the perfect match. Steve, no. But his friend kept coming, and Steve said, look, I even feel guilty of even having this conversation. I don't want to think about it. But the friend persisted. Steve finally relented. Turns out his friend was right. Steve and Annie hit it off from the start. And before long, he began to feel for her in a way that he had thought he would never feel again. And he began to reimagine what a new life would look like with him and Annie, his kids, her kids, and all together. And most importantly, he believed and he finally appreciated that moving forward was not the same as leaving his wife behind. Now, when Steve would talk about Annie in group, it was pretty clear he was excited, right? He had a pep in his step when he talked about her. And so it was a surprise to no one that when he came in a group one night, stood up and said, guys, I got an announcement. I'm getting married. High fives, back slaps, all the guys were thrilled for Steve. That was Steve's path, and it worked for him. And some of the other men would get remarried, others would not. But that wasn't the point. The point was that each of them had been intentional about reimagining that part of their lives. And what those lives included, now more than ever, it was important to have meaning in their life. And the fathers found meaning initially by giving back to one another in group. Right? They had been on the receiving end of pity and sympathy and casseroles for far too long. And all that was great and it was needed and appreciated. But the chance to be in the group with other people who needed help and to give back and to support others, that was invaluable. And then the men broadened their scope of giving back. They partnered with us to create a website that supports widowed parents anywhere. They helped us think through the first of our research projects. And finally, they encouraged Don and me to write their story in the hopes that it would inspire and inform anyone coping with loss. What meant most to these men, of course, though, was being good fathers. That's really what it came down to. Now, Russ has two boys who were 9 and 12 when their mother died after a brief but really intense bout with cancer. Russ is an ex-Marine. He's a pretty disciplined guy, but as a newly widowed father, he let that out the window. He knew what his kids had been through. He didn't want to be too harsh on them, so he let them get away with way too much, and he was basically parenting out of guilt. Over time, and after talking about it with the guys in group, Russ was able to recalibrate his approach. He was able to balance being good cop, bad cop, nurturer, disciplinarian, mom, and dad. One afternoon, he was at his son's final Little League game of the season when he noticed that two women were walking up the bleachers toward him. He didn't know them, but he recognized them as mothers of his son's teammates. The women came up to him, and one of the women said, "Excuse me, sir, we just wanted to let you know that we didn't want the season to end without telling you how wonderful you are with your kids. We've both noticed whether we win or lose or your son plays well or poorly, that you're always there for him and you just seem to be really connected. And that's just great." You know, Russ thought, "Thanks, okay." And the other woman said, "In fact, we also have a request. Would you mind talking to our husband sometime?" Now, at this point, Russ, am I being pranked? Like, kind of looking around. He wasn't. And on that day, he could believe that he was doing right by his boys. And that meant more to him than anything. The third thing that these guys taught us was precisely what made the group so empowering and so special in the first place. And that was the chance to connect with people who get it. Connect with people who they could feel comfortable sharing innermost thoughts and feelings with. And these men did it. When they got in together and got in group, whatever trepidation there was that first night was way long gone. These guys got down to business. They had difficult conversations. They confronted uncomfortable truths together. They really went there. And that was the active ingredient of the group. That was what made it so special. And it also is what made it so that these men could feel at a place where they could move forward. This connection really compelled them to want to move forward and then propelled them down their roads. Now, when Don and I first started this group, we thought we knew what we were doing. And we said, you know what? This is going to last 6 sessions. It's going to be a 6-session intervention. And that's what we told the men the first night. We said, this is the first of 6 times that we're going to get together. The fathers had other ideas. By the time this group of men stopped getting together on a monthly basis, they had come together month after month after month for nearly 4 straight years. Now, I came pretty quickly to admire these men, and I remain grateful for what they've meant to me. And I'm even more grateful to what their story has meant to countless others. There is no doubt that these are 7 special guys. They're also not unique. We continue to run support groups for widowed fathers, and we now have support groups for widowed mothers as well. And there are tens of thousands of newly widowed parents each year in this country alone, only a fraction of whom have the access to this kind of connection. And there's no reason why we can't change that. But the men's story goes far beyond just widowed parents. Their story is relevant for anyone coping with loss. Whether you have lost a parent, a close friend, a child, a pregnancy. Whether you've lost your job and your expected career path. Whether you or a loved one has been diagnosed with a serious health condition. Any situation when your expected trajectory of life gets snatched away, it is important to reimagine what you want your new life to look like, find meaning from your loss, and connect with others while doing so. You can create new paths. You can move forward. Thank you.